I'm going to talk about one project for 15 minutes. It's some houses off Moor Park Road, and then, as Simon alluded to earlier, we are both going to talk about a collaboration that we've been working on for 5 years. In some ways, in all of these projects, there's a common interest of mine, and it's really an idea about collectivity, about how, when we design even a single house, in this project it's 4 houses, when we design a group of houses, how can it be more than just a home for some individuals? How can it be a part of the city? How can it engender a sense of community and collective life, and go beyond the brief that is, in this case, as I say, 4 houses commissioned as 4 private homes. How can it go beyond that and be more than that? How can it be a place that people, beyond the private part of the home, how can it be a place that people collectively belong? How can it be a place that people appropriate in a kind of informal way? Is something that interests me a lot in the work of my practice. There's a wonderful photograph, you might know it, it's very famous, by Art Klein. It's in one of the back streets of Antwerp, where we've been working recently. And I just love the way in which the front door and the window to the dwelling is that moment of a powerful threshold between the public realm of the street and the life, the private life of home. So the project I'm showing, as I said, it's 4 houses. It's just 4 houses. And, you know, it occupies a site that was very, in a way, when we were asked to do this, was, I don't know if the client's in the room, Crispin Kelly, but it seemed like a very unpromising commission. It occupies a backland site, which you see here in this photo, in this old plan, a backland kind of triangular in shape, occupying, in a way, the leftover of the urban block. And as I'm sure you all know, this is quite common in London, this kind of leftover bit of space inside the urban block, are often with an access point, in this case, one access point off this road. And these spaces were, you know, from the 19th century used as horses and coal delivery and so on. And this site, you know, in fact, it used to have a kind of charming presence about it. It was, in a way, not the world of the higher grade houses around the perimeter. It was the leftover, and it was an informal place, but one that held charm and a sense of kind of collective belonging of a space. And that's something that I was interested to think about, how in this project we could rediscover, because it's a site that has no front. It's really a kind of inner world. So how can we still, even with an inner world site, create something public or civic or collective? So this photograph you see here is before, it's the site as it was presented to us. And by this point, this was taken in about 1980, the site is entirely built on. The individual dwellings you saw in that last photograph have been amalgamated into one mass. And again, this is quite typical of these inner urban sites. And so the question for us, if we were to, this is in Fulham, this is a kind of, you can imagine, a kind of nightmare to get planning for a project like this. What could we do to put homes on this site? This was currently occupied by a mix of workspace and commercial offices and so on. And we would have to think about removing volume. You can imagine a sort of almost chess game of how new dwellings could get light, have orientation, views, albeit contained views, And it led us to think about, in fact, I should say the client was pushing to make 5 homes on this site, which was very quickly knocked back by the authorities. But it led us to think about how to make a series of individual dwellings that could hold their own within this strange triangular site. And in a way, I suppose there's a collective idea for us is the way in which this point of entrance could arrive in a space that all the houses have a belonging to. Could say a kind of, in a way, it's a piece of circulation that leads to the front doors of every house. But how this could also feel like it's a space that all could have ownership of. And the design of this surface was important to us, the way we would use material to demarcate entrances as kind of doormats that others could walk across and be part of, was also tied up with this idea of the entrance and the entrance screen and so on. But this very difficult site, you can imagine, with views to take care of. The project seeks to, in a way, open up and close up views where it can, where the triangular geometry of the site was distant sufficient from the adjacent buildings. We could open up because we would have longer view, and where it was where it was closer in the tightness of the triangle, it would close down and look at itself, and in a way use the kind of conglomeration of buildings to create its own world, a kind of world within world, which occasionally has these glimpses or small visual connections to the brick context of its neighbour. So, as I say, sometimes it's closing down between dwellings and shortening views, and sometimes it's opening up again, the manner by which the plan works itself through in the nature of the site. It kind of presents itself as, in a way, 4 houses, but in fact it's really a kind of apartment building that at lower ground floor, it's 3-story houses, at lower ground floor, all connect. It's like an apartment building that is kind of cut into. But as it rises up through the plan, in fact, it starts to free and exploit or take advantage, one could say, of the shared space of the gardens of its neighbours. Here you see a view looking across the terraces that is predominantly south-facing, so the cut-ins have a kind of generally southern orientation. So the 3-story houses with their social spaces at the lower ground floor, and then the entry-level entrances at the mid-level, you see in this cross-section here, and the living spaces up on the roof. So I won't talk through the plans, but in essence, it really grows from one building volume at lower ground, starts to fragment at mid-level, starting to fragment with its entrances. You enter at mid-level, and then you rise up to the bedrooms on the upper levels. Essentially, 4 identical houses with small differences according to their position, their orientation, where it was possible to place a window in a room we would, and where it was not, we would take a point of placing adjacent to its neighbours. And in these images you see it rising up to the roof would be very important in this project to bring in light within this difficult site. So the staircase was an important vertical element in the way that light would percolate down through these dwellings. So I'm going to talk about project here. Firstly, the way Simon and I have been working together on this, it's called the de Beauvoir Estate project. It's for the London Borough of Hackney. It's a collaboration that we've been working on for 5 years, and it's not yet fully consented planning. These projects are long, hard-won, torturous, and I know a lot of you in the room know the back history of these kinds of projects. But just to say, it's one thing that is very unusual, and if I could speak about our collaboration, there are 10 buildings in this project and 330 homes. It keeps changing. And when Simon and I tendered for this job, we had a strong view about the estate and enjoyment of the estate, going back many years, and thought that this is not a project that one architect should do these buildings and another those. We should both do all the buildings together. It should be a genuine collaboration. And so, to say that all 10 buildings in this project are jointly authored, and it's been a very interesting process, and probably that's a whole other talk one day about how two practices with its own trajectories come together and largely agree on ways of... More and more. Largely agree on how to handle, a really complex project. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about the urban story and the, let's say, the kind of context and the urban ideas for 10, 15 minutes, and then Simon's going to talk about the buildings and how they are forming and how they come about. So I suppose, if anything, this project is about two kinds of urbanism. It's a post-war, it's a kind of post-war urbanism of tower blocks, 20-story tower blocks, and 6- and 7-story meandering slab blocks. But this project is also about a kind of pre-war urbanism, a kind of street-based, kind of Georgian Victorian kinds of neighbourhoods where streets are public spaces and buildings frame public spaces. It's interesting, the site used to look like this at the turn of the century, and even by, just after the Second World War, it still largely looked like this. A little bit of bomb damage, but it was pretty much intact, but it was cleared in the 50s, and we kind of often think, that's because it was taken out during the war, but that is not true. In fact, it was taken out, it was demolished in the 50s on a kind of ideological grounds. It was not a kind of, it was slums, and people didn't want to live there. And it was a kind of unpopular kind of neighbourhood. And interestingly, the neighbourhood to the north of the site, which largely still exists, was also kind of online to be demolished too, but was saved by a large landowner who currently still, Benyon Estates, who currently still own it. So that was interesting to us in our discussion, that the reason was ideological, principally. But the site today, here is the site cleared. It's a site that I think originally was deemed to have 500 homes through towers and slab blocks. You can kind of, the figure ground of the plan is familiar to us all. And what do we see? We see buildings that don't respect a kind of history of street pattern. The streets are all still there from the 19th century. We see a kind of interest on the part of the architect to place buildings in their own environment, in their playing with north-south orientation primarily, but buildings that are set back from the street, and then a public realm that's problematic, and that's the main thing I really want to talk about. But first, just to sing its praises, I mean, it's one estate in London that is extremely intact and coherent. And it's something we talked a lot about. It's used a lot in movies, this, because it's kind of very strong visual image, this urbanism. And this is something very strong about this place, and it's something we enjoyed about it. Something we wanted to celebrate in thinking about how to design some new buildings that would complement these, because it's fair to say that important to say that this project maintains all existing buildings with almost zero demolition. So the 330 new homes that would come to this site would be in addition to, and would find their placing in the gaps between buildings, such as the site in the foreground of this image. So it's a neighbourhood that from afar is very strong visually and very clear, but disastrous when it hits the ground. And I'm not sure I'm going to blame the original architects here, because I think, local authority and management and time and lack of clarity over a 40-year life, 50-year life of these buildings just brings confusion. But the base of a lot of this estate looks like this. It's unloved. It doesn't know what it wants to be. Nobody has, in some cases, even access to it. There's periodic attempts to kind of throw landscape briefs, landscape budgets at it and do stuff, but it is largely a mess. The way you kind of enter buildings, the way buildings hit the ground floor are often confusing, and on half levels down with living spaces. And in a way that sets the scene for the project. What to do with that. These are just some typical parts of the estate where it was deemed to be sites to build on. So as we find this estate, what are we thinking? It's like the site's been cleared, and the buildings are these great erratics that have just kind of washed into the site, with no kind of logic about their relationship to each other. Fronts and backs are confusing. Sometimes there's a kind of beletage to the living spaces, but then underneath there's another dwelling that isn't meant to be there, it seems. So I should just say the way the Commission is presented to us, and it's also quite a conundrum in the project. These red lines, these red dotted lines are sites. And there is no doubt in our minds, Simon and I thinking about this project first as a master plan or as a site-wide strategy, but that's not what the Commission was. The Commission was not a master plan. It was presented from the housing delivery unit of Hackney, who are only concerned with housing numbers and housing delivery, not what is the relationship between these new housing buildings and the wider context. Now, I think we'd all agree that's completely nuts, but that's to do with a number of things. It's to do with politics, budgets, and it's to do with communication to existing residents. The existing residents on this estate are about to get 10 new buildings. And I think the reason is they couldn't make promises that they couldn't know across the 5, 6, 7 year life of this project that they could really keep. So they didn't want to commission a master plan, but certainly under the carpet, we were thinking about this project as a master plan that would then deliver a series of new buildings and a series of new homes. And central to our master plan, or central to our thinking of the project, is a landscape idea, that existing buildings, the existing buildings and the new buildings would frame spaces. And so we started to develop this idea that what doesn't get built on by new buildings and what is not road space and pavements, everything else would become this proposition of 24 landscapes, all of them productive in different ways. Some gardens for growing food, some simply a single fruit tree, a walnut tree with play space. All of these spaces have a dual use. They all have one is a bowling green, one is kids play. One would have a cafe that or opens up onto it. So it's an idea of which in a way is in stark contrast to the way the estate sits today. Today the estate has no idea about the public realm, and our core idea, our starting point, is to think about this big landscape project, a landscape of a collective landscape of growing spaces that everybody can use together. So number 16 doesn't just belong to this building, and number 4 doesn't just belong to the buildings around it. All spaces belong to everybody, and they all connect via a series of paths and links. I'm going to pass you to Simon, who's going to talk about, in a way, I suppose the kind of big architectural idea that, in a way, is built on this
foundation of landscape.
And I'm going to sit here.
You're going to sit down.
I'm going to sit here a bit.
One thing that Steve didn't say is that, in terms of the odds of this playing out the way it has, they were low, because this was actually 2 projects tendered in 2 completely different frameworks, which some architects had to win, and we fortunately did, and then this collaboration has taken its character. So this is an extremely unlikely outcome. But as Steve started to say, and as some of those photographs showed beautifully, we have huge admiration for those buildings. We have huge admiration for their kind of character, and quite a lot of the logic. Not the urbanism they create, but the homes they make, and many of the principles that underpin them that are perfectly valid still today. Typologically, there were basically there were 3 types, but 2 very clear types. One are the point blocks, which are about 15 to 19 stories. Second are the meandering apartment buildings, gallery access, deck access, sometimes lateral flats, sometimes maisonettes. And then where the kind of architectural types, let's say, get looser, is when we're talking about lower rise of apartment buildings and terraces, which are typically houses, and they vary in height and they vary in, and it's probably the result of the kind of chronology of the design development, that what started out was very, very clear in those first 2 types and became slightly less clear in those final piecings in. But so we debated whether we should try and make a tower, and one of the kind of rules we set ourselves is if we're going to do something, we should do it twice. And if we can't do it twice, we shouldn't do it. And given the nature of the sites we were given, we couldn't see an argument for making 2 point blocks. So the predominant kind of type is the apartment building. Great. So the new bits are grey and the old bits are beige. But there is also in there a row of terrace houses, and there is another row of terrace houses in the wider plan. So the deck access, gallery access apartment buildings, they're 6-storey. The new ones are 6-storey. One of the things which becomes very apparent when you start to see other bits of the other drawings is that, so we really sought in a way to emulate what we found in type, but also in character, which you'll see. But of course, we're working in a completely different legislative, policy-based situation. So floor-to-floor heights vary, how one deals with insulation, how one deals with all sorts of things, thermal, coal bridging, and so on. So you end up in a way with a new generation of buildings. So this new generation of buildings is recognisably taking shapes, courtyards, terraces, linear block that then joins to another open court, starting to make sense of the things around it, combined here with the terrace making sense of this. And that kind of building a logic for a recognisable urban grain that recognises the 20th century city, but also enjoys the pre-war, the 19th, 18th century city. And so, for example, these two L-shaped blocks situate this, and it becomes even more apparent in the next slide, this sort of floating element. Can I dare to say Beaux-Arts? But you know what I mean? There's a formal structure in which these buildings ground the thing that they find in the city. And that same principle is done here with this L-shaped block and this L-shaped block, which locates what was otherwise a tower some way away from a road and starts to build an urban space, let's say loosely a square, between these various buildings. So something which is sort of, one of the things that's consistent about these typologies that we found is they're kind of reluctant to engage with the urban structure of streets. And so the role that many of these buildings do, in a way, is to ground the old ones, the existing ones, in the pre-war, pre-20th century urban grain. And that becomes very clear when you see the way that these corner buildings not only frame this, but ground themselves in the structure of the 19th century city. But one of the things that is consistent is everything's orthogonal. So there is a slight kind of, it's not a literal way in which, for example, this open courtyard building relates to the other buildings that frame this crossroads. And so you can see, again, a building here that frames this space, this courtyard in conjunction with that terrace, making sense of what was, previously just a meandering building wandering through largely open space. So we did this with types. We did this with open courtyard buildings, L-shaped buildings of various types, and linear buildings. And in the end, we'll have 11 buildings, 3 of which will be open courtyards. Can I do the maths? I shouldn't have started. 5 which will be L-shaped buildings, I think, 1 which will be linear, and then 2 terraced houses. And they're all made up, with the exception of houses, from the same flats. So we've got 2 one-bed types, 3 two-bed types, and 1 3-bed. And they often have a corner balcony, you'll see, and occasionally they have what could be mistaken here for a corner balcony, but actually form as part of a terrace, paired balconies. And one of the things over this 5-year period, as the 2 schemes of evolved, even though the first 180 homes have got planning, we effectively, as the legislation changes and the policies change, and as our design thinking changes, it all flows backwards and forwards to the point where, although technically they are two schemes, purely from the GLA's perspective, so we don't get bogged down in, estate regen questions, and not we as in Hackney, our client. So, as far as the outside world is concerned, they remain as two projects, but for us, they are absolutely one project. And the building blocks of the homes creates the building blocks of the buildings, and the building blocks of buildings are what is then essentially grounding and situating the existing buildings and making sense of that relationship between centuries of construction and centuries of city. What's highlighted here is all the entrances. And you'll notice it's no accident that they are civic. They are, to all intents and purposes, they're not public, but they are very nearly public. They're playing a role in marking corners. In a way, there's this divide between the north side of Downham Road, which is one of wealth and class to a certain extent, and because this is all mixed tenure, what this is going to do socially is to start to bring a much more balanced community across Downham Road and quite deep into the 60s estate. And it's, part of that plausibility is the generosity of the way in which these buildings relate to their context. And so then this, that is one of those red highlighted entrances, a very generous hall with a lobby and a fantastic elliptical staircase lift. And so through the courtyard then to a spiral staircase. So the collective common parts of the building are social, but also, can I say, delightful. I mean, the idea is that one's dealing with how people perceive mass housing. And one of the things which is evident in the original generation of buildings is they are functionalist buildings. They're functional in the way that they maybe relate to the sun and the prevailing wind and things like that. They don't relate to the city, but they also don't allow themselves that generosity of progressing, as it were, through the building and recognizing your neighbors, taking time, having a conversation, pausing. So, it's no accident, and it doesn't matter actually whether they're L-shaped, open courtyards, corner buildings, let's call them, or linear buildings. They always have a very carefully considered loggia, which of course is a very close relative to the 1960s version, but with a completely different reading, because it's one that invites a recognition of collectivity. And it does it either by completing the space in the open U-shape, or it does it by completing an existing space in the case of the L-shaped building. Now, the project is evolving and a slightly different entrance has developed, but one where, interestingly, we started out with this idea of barns for waste and bicycles and plant and so on. And what's actually happened is some of those things have been absorbed back into the original fabric. But the thing that is preserved as a sort of a delightful but more rudimentary building is the bike shed. And this coincides with the entrance, which is now shifted to being the end of the cloister, or the end of the loggia. And there's some other complex things going on here. Not only have you got the relationship between the two staircases and the loggia intact, but this is a bel etage, because most of the ground floor spaces, or about half of the ground floor spaces, are non-residential commercial spaces, contributing to the street life, and half are homes, or a third probably. But so you've got some delightful kind of things happening here in terms of how one gets via the lift or the stair to this raised terrace and onto the bel étage. And you start to see also the way in which the balconies, probably on the next slide, mark the corners of the building. And then we've got some others in between. And one of the things that's also, this plan is slightly out of date. One of the things that's we're managing to achieve is more habitable rooms on the balcony. So we've got kitchens and living spaces we've got living spaces with a dual aspect through, which I suppose this is what this shows, but it's a further development which in a sense changes this diagram. So the bedrooms at the front, the loggia, the balcony is in front of the living space, which then runs through, and the kitchen shifts to here. So that basic strategy doubles the amount of contact that the home has with the loggia, which again shifts it further away from this kind of functional reading of an escape route into something which is far more convivial and social. And so in a sense, now moving on to the character, this is very new and emerging and evolving, let's say. But this way in which, the building, this is the gable elevation, and this is this arched gable is the face of the cycle shed, and it is the primary entrance, which is a very generous kind of recess around a column, and is the beginning of that kind of tracing of a line around around the courtyard, and an intentionally plain elevation animated by a window within the bel étage flat at this end and the entrance here, and otherwise the balconies on the corners, which is in contrast to, I guess, so we've got where you would have said that the existing buildings, they didn't really have fronts and backs. They had, access, and they had the opposite of access. But what we have developed is a very clear sense of what is outward facing and inward facing, an animated, but still in a sense a functional arrangement of fenestration that relates to rooms. But so that moment with the cycle shed, that gable, is a very important counterpoint to that kind of relatively repetitive nature of fenestration and occupation that goes with homes and facades of homes. But we enjoyed, in the same way that we enjoyed the typology, we've also enjoyed the character of these buildings, the rhythms and repetition, the colour, the grain, the role of the expressed slab, these panels of brickwork, the fenestration, the coloured spandrel panels, all things which we've enjoyed. And similarly, this expression of the deck, but how it gets expressed anew as something which is much more convivial. And so this elevation is just typical of many, where we've got ground floor uses, non-residential, workspaces basically, and we've got the rhythms of the joining up of the homes and the distribution of the windows, but then marked by the staircase, which not only pierces that datum of the parapet, but also is marked by this elliptical window, which of course is the inflection of the elliptical plan of the staircase inside, and therefore that kind of balancing of the function and the civicness of these buildings. And the houses are, in a way, perhaps more relaxed about their relationship to the original fabric and order of expressed slabs and so on, but forming part of that dialogue between old and new. And Steve developed a very tight plan for the house, almost square, but fractionally not square, is that right? Out by, it's about 100 mil off, but it's torn into a square home, which is partly, of course, the nature of kind of driving a tower house, because it is a 4-story home. But also it's kind of intimate, compressed plan and its accentuated height enables it to engage with the taller things around it and then make very fine, thin terraces which then work within the constraints that we were working in terms of space, urban available plots. And so we have a mixture of, and we've got we started with a 4-story one, and it's likely to end up as a 3-story home, but it's the second primary type within the scheme. And these last few slides really just showing the character of the buildings, which is, as I guess you've sensed from the two of us, taking the language and co-opting something which was problematic in terms of coal bridging and so on, but delightful in the order, the role of the what now are thermally broken structural string courses, which will bear the weight of hand-laid brickwork, which will kind of teeter on the edge of these string courses, in between which there are windows, which form panels, panels between the brick panels, and again, one has spandrels. And you can see the use of the colour, and you see the consistency of the language. Buildings are taller, but they're doing various things. They're framing down a road, they're re-establishing streets within the estate, they're establishing clear thoroughfares, and they're establishing, as Steve was talking about, courts, gardens, and a wholly newly structured landscape of productivity, addressing the canal, some existing productive space, and occasionally moments where these buildings connect, and again the deck that joins them taking on a kind of a social and civic role. Thanks.